Okay, so today I want to talk about post-communist transitions. But more specifically, I want to talk about three transitions: political transitions, economic transitions, and then resolving unresolved processes of nation building. First, though, a little bit of history. Communism is an ideology born out of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. And after a few fits and starts, like the Paris Commune of 1870, communism was first seriously put into practice on a large scale after the Bolshevik Revolution of Russia in 1917. Now, ideally, Leninist politics is organized around a one-party state led by Soviets. Now, Soviets are worker councils that are supposed to be run more or less democratically. Rapidly, though, this ideal of autonomous Soviets deteriorates into a centralized one-party state in Russia, which became the model for subsequent communist regimes in China, Cuba, and Eastern Europe. Communism probably reached the height of its prestige around the world in 1945, when Russia liberated most of Eastern Europe from Nazi rule, and communist guerrilla groups provided the backbone of resistance to fascism in most countries like France or Greece or Italy and even Germany itself. Even in Western Europe, communist parties regularly polled in the 30% range in the 1950s and 1960s, especially in France, Italy, and Greece, where communist resistance had been the strongest to Nazi rule. When Mao won the Chinese Civil War against Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang in 1949, communism seemed to many people to be the wave of the future. At its height, perhaps one-third of the world's population lived under communist rule, with many more countries in Scandinavia, Africa, or Asia trying to blend a third way between socialism on the one hand and market economies on the other. Now, in particular, communism was seen as the antidote to the excesses of industrial capitalism, as well as the excesses of nationalism. Most people know that communist economies were centrally planned, and what did that mean in practice? Well, in practice, that meant that production and pricing decisions were dictated by the regime. Choices of occupation were often quite limited, and these were made by central direction, primarily to serve the interests of the party or the country. There were no taxes, really, because planning entities determined salaries in the first place. There was no redistribution because the distribution of income was already centrally planned. Benefits like healthcare or childcare were nominally universal and available to all without charge. In practice, of course, the inefficiencies of the communist economic system meant that large black markets arose, and that the rationing of goods and services was often done through waiting lines or currying political favor. Now, communism, as we just noted, is avowedly against private property, but what's less well known is that it's also in principle against national or ethnic identities defining a person's individual interests. Only class, and in communist regimes, class equality was held to define an individual's interests. And therefore, in communist countries, a lot was done to repress ethnic distinctiveness and nationalisms, especially including within the Soviet Union, where vast swaths of population were resettled from the densely populated regions of Western Russia to the steppes of Central Asia, the Baltic republics, and the plains of Siberia. And this was done more or less intentionally in order to mix up the populations and dilute the fervor of any particular ethnic resistance to communist rule. As a result, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in the years between 1989 and 1991, under half the population of several Soviet republics were in fact nationals of that republic. So under half of the people living in Kazakhstan were ethnically Kazakh, and only a very, very large minority, maybe even a small majority of Ukrainians spoke Ukrainian and were linguistically and ethnically Ukrainian because so many Russians and people from other parts of the Soviet Union had been resettled to those places. So in addition to a political transformation and an economic transformation, there were real political debates that had to be settled about what kind of republics were going to emerge from the Soviet world. So from the former Soviet Union, which contained republics, and of course the communist countries that were under Soviet influence primarily in Eastern Europe, what would those countries look like? Would they be nation states or would they be multi-ethnic states? And what will be done with the millions of ethnic Russians primarily living in places like Ukraine, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, or Belarus? How would Russia, yes, handle this, but also how would Yugoslavia and other multi-ethnic countries handle their hopelessly intertwined ethnic groups? Sometimes separations were peaceful, as with the 1994 divorce between the Czech Republic and Slovakia, which had once been, of course, Czechoslovakia. Sometimes the separations were not so peaceful. If you think of the war in the Balkans between the Bosnian Muslims, Orthodox Serbs, and Catholic Croats. And finally, sometimes the separations just didn't happen, as with Russia's suppression of Chechen rebels or Estonia's attempts to try to teach Estonian to a very large Russian minority in Estonia. So let's talk about these different changes a little bit. Let's talk about political changes. Was this period between 1989 and 1991 roughly, were these revolutions? Yeah, these were revolutions because you had a change of regime brought about by intense public pressure. And some were essentially bloodless. Most of them were essentially bloodless revolutions, except for perhaps Romania, where you had quite a bit of violence, and China, where you didn't have a revolution, right? The Tiananmen Square revolt of 1989 failed to produce a transition, whereas the revolts tended to succeed everywhere else. Several political transitions were actually negotiated. That is to say, in Hungary and Poland, members of dissident groups and trade unions who were opposing the regime, as well as members of the previous communist regime, actually sat down at a table to discuss how things were going to be changed. So it all seemed very political and civilized. But that doesn't mean you didn't have a wholesale change of regime. You really did. A completely different political system, and on top of that, a completely different economic system. Now, several questions were raised, right? So for one of the major questions that was raised was whether the transition to democracy and to capitalism required that those involved with the past regime stay out of it, not participate, or should they be included? After all, most of the people with any and all political experience were people who were deeply involved with the regime. Should there be some reckoning, some system for having trials for crimes committed under the authority of communist rule, right? So communist totalitarian rule in many countries produced executions, torture, sending people to work camps. You had things that I think can fairly be called crimes against humanity. And the question was, were people who were involved in these things, despite their being done under the authority of communist rule, should they be tried for these crimes? Should they be prosecuted? How is this going to be handled? Of course, there's many different ways to do it. You know, there can be amnesties, there can be truth and reconciliation committees like there was in South Africa, which wasn't a communist transition, but it was a transition. So, of course, this has to be done against the background of everybody under the new regime saying, oh, no, we opposed the previous regime, we were resisting, we weren't complicit. How do we find out what the truth was? How do we even know what the truth was in regimes that were so centered around secrecy? And that was just one of the major challenges of the early 1990s. And different countries did this differently. There was not one type of transition. There were many different kinds of transitions. Some countries went a long way to eliminate all traces of the old order, whereas other countries included the old leaders in the new regime, and the old leaders basically took on new colors and went to battle in electoral politics, becoming one of many parties after having for a long time lived under one party. So unlike communism, which really shares a single vision of the good life and how society should be organized and so on and so forth, post-communism doesn't really share a vision. There are many different kinds of post-communist experiences, and there are probably as many as there are post-communist countries. Some of these countries have been drawn to a more European model, others have been drawn back into a Russian sphere of influence. And arguably Russia in 1991 was much less part of Europe, at least ideologically, than it was in 1917 when Russia was going through many of the industrialization processes that Western Europe had gone through, decades earlier. If you looked at a table of countries, you can see that not all the countries became democratic. So there are some consolidated democracies: the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Slovenia, Croatia, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, and Hungary all have close to consolidated democracies. Then there are those who are somewhere in between. They have electoral politics, but the electoral politics are severely flawed, or there's serious restrictions on civil society, or there's a kind of presidentialism that's turning towards authoritarianism. These are kind of on the continuum between total autocracies and democracies. So countries like Serbia, Romania, Albania, Macedonia, Ukraine, Bosnia, Moldova, Georgia, and Armenia are all what you might call flawed democracies. More or less flawed depending on the case. And of course, there's those countries that are just not democracies at all, and these are primarily the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, with one exception. So we have Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and then the exception, which is Belarus, which is in Eastern Europe. So there's a huge geographic component here, right? So the Central Asian countries, the Eastern European countries, and then what you might call the Southeastern European or Balkan countries are a little bit followed different examples. You had the countries that were very close to Western Europe, and those tended to follow the Western European model. You had those in Central Asia, which tended to follow much more the Russian model. And then you had the countries of Southeastern Europe, which are kind of in between. They didn't have that geographic proximity to Western Europe, but they were pulled towards Western Europe and had some history of contact with Western Europe, but at the same time also were influenced by Russia and more autocratic influences more generally. Now, in general, those countries that were more democratic also became more capitalist. It was not the case that the countries that were more autocratic, more authoritarian, also developed market economies. These transitions towards democracies were largely accompanied by transitions to more market economic systems. Now, even among the most developed, politically developed Eastern European countries, former communist countries, transitions towards democracy were always incomplete, both as a set of political institutions, so based on the rules of the game, if you will, and as a regulative ideal of how people are supposed to behave. That is to say, people's habits and people's ways of thinking about politics. And it takes time to change all of these things. You can change the rules actually pretty quickly, but it takes a lot of time to change people's habits and people's ways of thinking about how politics are supposed to go. So countries showed a lot of uneven progress, both towards free and fair elections, peaceful transitions of power between different political parties, civil and political rights, the rule of law, independent judiciaries, free and independent media outlets, protection of minorities, and so on and so forth. These are all characteristic of the rules of democracy. But the degree to which all of these things were endorsed and treated as normal wasn't always equal, especially those things having to do with people's political habits. So, for instance, should someone be hired because of their political connections? Is that okay or not? Should officials be able to gain financially from their decisions while in office? Is that okay or not? Does interactions with public officials require a bribe to ensure timely and effective service? Once again, these were things that were fairly normal under the Soviet Union. I would also add that joining the European Union also helps as a kind of pre-commitment mechanism for countries that might have been tempted to backslide and that really want to make a commitment towards democracy, particularly given that often on their eastern borders they have less democratic countries, whereas on the western borders they have more democratic countries. And so a lot of Eastern European countries applied to and eventually joined the European Union in the early 2000s or mid-2000s. So Hungary, Romania, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, all of these countries of Eastern Europe, which became, most of them, quite democratic by adopting European Union law and regulations, this transnational law which helps regulate the domestic political systems of all European countries within the European Union. Adopting that legal system helps cement that transition. It makes it much harder to turn back because some of your politics is no longer under your control. Joining the European Union involves uh, getting a lot of benefits, of course, but it also, like access to a very, very large market. But it also involves some costs with respect to national self-determination. You don't get to set all the rules about trade in particular, about labor law, and so on, environmental systems, and so on and so forth. Those laws are often decided on at the EU level, and although you have a vote, your vote might not be decisive. Okay, moving from political change, let's talk about economic change. The main debate with respect to economic change was whether to transition towards a market economy gradually or whether to do everything at once, which was often called shock therapy, where you privatize all assets, you sell everything immediately, and you basically let markets happen through aggressive privatization and rapid changes in the legal system that supports capitalism. So legal systems about property rights, about transfers of property, and so on and so forth. Note that this, like politics, involves both a change of rules and a change of people's habits. Right? People have to become more entrepreneurial. They have to learn to shop around. They have to learn to pay taxes, by the way, because filling out tax forms was not something that many people in the Eastern Bloc ever had to do. Whereas in the West, of course, we have to pay taxes, and sometimes quite a lot of them, and that requires, again, a whole skill set that people never had to learn, and they suddenly, either rapidly or gradually, would have to learn. So, do you rapidly transition to the market with a lot of possible pain, or do you try to muddle through and liberalize the economy step by step, selling off industries one by one, rather than all at once, but with the risk that the process, if you do it gradually, might stall as the political risks become greater? Different countries try different things. So Poland and Russia both tried shock therapy. That is to say, they both privatized as quickly as possible. Hungary and Ukraine were more gradual. Uh, and we see different results. Poland, is a relative success. Um, and so is Hungary. Hungary took a while to catch up to Poland, but now Hungary is doing about as well as Poland. On the other hand, Ukraine and Russia did a lot of backsliding. But then the question is why? Did it have to do with their economic policies, or did it have to do with their geography, their access to foreign markets? Poland is very close to Germany, for example. Maybe that helped. Ukraine, has had some trouble since 2010, 2011 because of the war that's going on in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine with Russian separatism. Uh, so, we have a lot of questions about why these economies aren't doing so well, or why do we see a variety of results. I think a lot of the countries that are near the borders of the European Union and joined the EU did fairly well. Central Asian countries on average did worse. Landlocked countries on average did worse. So did countries with oil. All of these countries tended to do worse and become more authoritarian. And even within the Balkans, within that southern European region, the northern countries near Italy and Austria did fairly well. Countries like Slovenia, which are on the northern tip of former Yugoslavia, done very well. On the other hand, countries in the bottom tip of the Balkans, near Greece, in other words, so the Macedonias, the Montenegros, the Kosovos, have done a lot less well. Bosnia certainly has done very poorly, although Bosnia was devastated by a decade of war in the 1990s. Russia, of course, has seen a little bit of both, right? So up until 2002, you could have said, well, Russia has successfully privatized. It has a competitive economy, a competitive political system, and a competitive market economy. After a series of rapid privatizations in the 1990s, and then after Putin became president for the first time in 2002, you see a rollback. So nationalizations of many companies, and of course less competition in the political system, bit by bit. You see that the gradualists like Hungary have caught up to the early privatizers like Poland, but again, you have this wide variety of results, and I have a table here that might help fixate some of these results. So if you look at countries, okay, countries have done very well. We tend to forget about East Germany, which was, of course, reunited with Germany in 1989. Still, the average income in East Germany is less than that of West Germany, so incomes have not equalized. But if you think about it in a certain way, the economy of East Germany, or the average income, I'm sorry, in East Germany is about 84% of that in West Germany. But that's actually less than the difference between, say, Mississippi and Connecticut in the United States. Mississippi's average income is about half of that of Connecticut. So if you think about within-country differences, East Germany is within a certain range of tolerance. It's not quite caught up. It's not equal to West Germany, but a lot of efforts have been made to integrate those two economies that were very different. The Czech Republic, of the countries that didn't join other countries, Western European countries, is the next best performer. And again, the Czech Republic has a history of industrialization. Has always been close to Western Europe. I mean, it's a stone's throw from Prague to Berlin. I mean, it's really quite close, a couple hours by train at most. Slovenia is the next best performer, and again, Slovakia has done very well. The Baltic countries, with access to the sea and close to Scandinavia, have done very well. Poland has done quite well. Hungary is more interesting because Hungary is further to the east, not directly related on any border with Western Europe, except I think maybe Austria. Let's say Russia has maintained a certain standard of living, but with ups and downs, and certainly with a very uneven distribution of income. And then further down the list, you have this mix of Eastern European and maybe some of the better Central Asian countries. And right at the bottom, you have a lot of Central Asian countries, primarily Muslim republics, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, some of which have oil, some of which don't. And of course, you have Moldova, which is a Romanian-speaking country sandwiched in between Romania and Ukraine, very poor. And so you have a few Balkan countries. So there's no huge clear trend. I've tried to organize it on this table by sort of looking at first, were you part of the Soviet Union or not? And you can see right at the bottom, almost all of these countries were former Soviet republics. They were not client states like East Germany or Czech Republic. So right at the top, you see mostly non-client states, and at the bottom, you see mostly client states of the Soviet Union. So it seems like, at the margin, that being part of the Soviet Union was not helpful, or being more integrated into the Soviet economy was not helpful. And I think war has to play some role. Like, so if you have a country that had a civil war or had a major international conflict, that's going to affect your results. And so you see it, you look at the bottom, you see a few countries that, particularly in the Balkans, that were involved in wars. Borders to the European Union, particularly in 1992. Of course, the European Union has expanded since then, so now many more countries border the European Union. But you can see at the top, lots of countries had borders, either land borders or sea borders, with the European Union. Most of the countries at the bottom of this list, lower GDP per capita countries, did not have borders with the European Union. And finally, oil plays some role, but not a huge role. So all in all, several central points come out here. You can see that there's a large variety of experiences. There's a large variety of post-communist transitions. There's not one main explaining factor. There's some things that seem to be correlated with doing better and doing more poorly, so more economic success and sort of being further along with the transition to democracy. But there's, again, no one thing that stands out as being, yes, that's the thing that is determining the differences between all of these post-transition experiences. Again, it's complicated because it's not just one transition, but it's many transitions. And so as a result, there are many different variables operating side by side. All right, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for listening. And as always, if you'd like to, feel free to check out my YouTube page for more videos on philosophy, politics, and economics.